Okay, welcome back to the pandemic reading of Dave Cullen's Columbine. This will cover the study guide for chapters 12 through 15, but I'm going to split the video up in two parts. I'm going to do 12 and 13 on this part, and then 14 and 15 on the next part, because I was having a hard time exporting it all to YouTube. So here's chapter 12, The Perimeter. The story took 28 minutes to hit local television. The networks quickly followed. Something awful was happening at a high school near Denver. Coverage began with confused reports about a shooting in the outlying suburbs. No confirmation on injuries, but multiple shots, as many as 9, and possible explosions. Automatic weapons might be involved, possibly even grenades. A fire had been reported. SWAT teams were mobilizing. CNN was locked in on Kosovo. NATO had gone to war over the genocide there. Night had just fallen in Belgrade, and American warplanes were massing on the horizon, about to pulverize fresh targets across the Serb capital. At 11:54 a.m. Denver time, CNN cut to Jeffco and stayed there nonstop all afternoon. The broadcast networks began interrupting the soaps. Columbine quickly overshadowed the war. No one seemed to know what had actually happened. Was it still happening? Apparently. As the networks went live with the story, gunfire and explosions were erupting somewhere inside that school. Outside, it was mayhem. Choppers circled, and police, firefighters, parents, and journalists had descended on the campus. Nobody was going inside. Fresh waves of support troops were arriving by the minute, but they had just crowded around the building. Occasionally, students would scurry out. Local stations kept surveying the area hospitals. "There are no patients yet," the journalist reported from one, "but they are expecting one victim with an ankle wound." Jeffco 911 operators were overwhelmed. Hundreds of students were still inside the building. Many had cell phones and were calling with conflicting reports. Thousands of parents from all around the area were dialing the same center, demanding information. Many students gave up on 911 and called the TV stations. Local anchors began interviewing them live on the air, and the cable networks picked up their feeds. So that is number 1 on chapter 12. Witnesses confirmed injuries. A girl said she watched like 3 people get shot. "Did it look like they were shooting at specific people?" a reporter asked. "They were just shooting. They didn't care who they shot at. They were just shooting, and then they threw a grenade or they threw something that blew up." There seemed to be no end of witnesses, though most had seen chaos, but no one causing it. A senior described the first moments of awareness. "Okay, I was sitting in math class, and all of a sudden we look out, and there's people that are sprinting down the math hall. We open the door, we hear a shot, a loud bang, and then we hear some guy go, 'Holy crap, there's a guy with a gun.' So everybody starts freaking out. One of my friends goes up to the door and says, 'There's a guy standing there.' We evacuate to the corner of our classroom, and my teacher just doesn't know what to do because she's so freaked." There appeared to be several shooters, all boys, all white, all Columbine students. Some were shooting in the parking lot, some in the cafeteria, some upstairs while roaming the halls. Somebody was positioned on the roof. Some of the assault team wore t-shirts, others advanced in long black trench coats. One pair included one of each. Some had hats, and 1 or 2 were hiding behind ski masks. Some of this mix-up was standard crime scene confusion. Contrary to popular conception, eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, especially when witnesses were under duress. Memories get jumbled, and witnesses imagine missing details without realizing they're doing it. But much of this understanding was due to specific factors. Eric discarded his trench coat at the top of the stairs almost as soon as he began shooting. Dylan kept his on until he got to the library. Each costume change created another shooter. The school's location on a hill with nearby entrances on both floors allowed Eric and Dylan to be seen upstairs and downstairs almost simultaneously. The long-range weapons scattered gunfire over shooting radius hundreds of yards wide. Distant witnesses had no idea where the shooters were. They only knew they were under attack. So that's number 2, and there are really 3 parts to number 2. So make sure you get all 3 factors. Some witnesses listened carefully and correctly located the source of the turbulence, but the bomb blasts often led them astray, particularly when bombs landed on the roof. Several kids were sure something was coming from up there. They spotted a frightened air conditioner repairman and instantly identified him as the rooftop gunman. Word whipped through the Columbine community. Kids called home on their cell phones the minute they got to safety, or someplace they hoped would remain safe. About 500 students were off campus, either for lunch or sick or cutting class. Their first sign of a problem came when they hit police barricades as they tried to return.
Cops were everywhere, more cops than they had ever seen. Nate Dykeman was one of the kids heading back in. He was stunned by the stories he heard. Nate had gone home for lunch, same as he did every day, but on the way out, he had seen something peculiar. Eric walking into the building from the wrong parking lot at the wrong time. He should have been walking out. Eric and Dylan had both been missing that morning. They were up to something, obviously. Odd that they hadn't included him, or at least called. Maybe not Eric, he wasn't the most thoughtful friend, but Dylan was. Dylan would have called. There had been some weird shit going on between those two lately. Pipe bombs and guns. When Nate heard about the shooting, he got nervous. When someone mentioned the trench coats, that sealed it. This can't be happening, Nate thought. This isn't happening. He ran into his girlfriend, who was stopped at an intersection. She was also a good friend of Eric's. She followed Nate home. Then Nate did the same thing nearly everyone was doing. He started dialing friends, checking in to make sure they were all safe. He wanted to call Dylan's house, but that was just way too scary. Soon. He would call soon. He checked on some other friends first. While Deputy Gardner was firing at Eric, he knew help was on the way. Female down at a high school unleashed a frenzy of police radio traffic. Jeffco issued a metro-wide mutual aid request, prompting police officers, firefighters, and paramedics from around the city to begin racing toward the foothills. The police band got so congested so quickly that Gardner couldn't alert dispatch that he'd arrived. After engaging Eric, Gardner got back in his car and radioed for backup. This time he got through. Gardner followed protocol and did not pursue Eric inside. Deputy Paul Smoker was a motorcycle cop writing a speeding ticket on the edge of Clement Park when the first dispatch came in. He radioed that he was responding and gunned his motorcycle into the grass. He tore through soccer fields and baseball diamonds and arrived at the north side of the building just moments after Gardner's gunplay. He parked behind an equipment shed where a bleeding boy had taken shelter. Another patrol car pulled up right behind him, then another. They all wound round the corner from Gardner, just out of sight. The boy told them he had been shot by Ned Harris. Nobody had any paper, so a deputy wrote the name on the hood of his patrol car. They ran forward to help another bleeding student lying in the grass. As they approached, they passed into Deputy Gardner's sight line around the corner. It had been 2 minutes since Gardner's gun battle with Eric, and he was out of his car with his pistol drawn. Smoker and Gardner spotted each other as Eric reappeared inside the west exit doorway. "There he is!" Gardner yelled. He opened fire again. Eric ducked back behind the door frame. He poked his rifle through the shattered pane and returned fire. A couple of students were on the move again, and Eric tried to nail them too. Smoker could see where Gardner was firing, but the doorway was blocked from view. He maneuvered down to where he could see Eric and got off 3 shots. Eric retreated. Smoker heard gunfire inside. More students ran out of the building. He did not pursue. Deputies continued arriving. They attended to the scared and wounded and struggled to determine what they were up against. Witnesses came to them. Kids saw their police cars at the top of the hill and came running. Some were bleeding. All were desperate. They lined up behind the cars and crouched near the officers for protection. They provided lots of accurate information. Reports on the police radio, conflicted wildly, but any one group in one location tended to offer remarkably consistent accounts. These kids described 2 gunmen in black trench coats shooting Uzis or shotguns and throwing hand grenades. At least one appeared to be high school age, and some victims knew them. Kids kept arriving. The cars were feeble protection, and the crowd was likely to draw attention. The deputies decided it was paramount to evacuate them. They directed some of the boys to tear their shirts into strips and treat one another's wounds while they devised an escape plan. They decided to line several patrol cars up as a defensive wall and shuttle the students to safer ground behind them. Every cop had been trained for events like this. Protocol called for containment. The deputies broke into watch teams. They could cover a handful of the 25 exits and protect those students who were already out. Setting up a perimeter, they called it. They would repeat the perimeter phrase endlessly that afternoon. So there is the answer to number 3 on chapter 12. Paramedics were establishing triage areas away from the school, and the deputies worked on getting the kids there. Cops would lay down suppressive fire to protect evacuations and scare off opportunistic attacks. They had no idea whether the gunmen were still present or interested. The officers did not observe or engage the gunmen for some time. Newly arriving officers covered additional exits. Gunfire was audible to the first officers and continued through the arrival of hundreds more. Deafening explosions kept erupting inside the school. The exterior walls along the cafeteria and the library rumbled from some of the blasts. Deputy Smoker could see the green windows buckling. Half a dozen students ran out the cafeteria doors after one shockwave. They made it to another deputy who was guarding the south exits. "Are we going to die?" one of the girls asked him. No. She asked again. No. She kept asking. The deputy thought the shooters might flee the building, cross the field, and hop a chain link fence separating the school grounds from their first subdivision. "We didn't know who the bad guy was, but we soon realized the sophistication of their weapons," Deputy Smoker said later. "These were big bombs, big guns. We didn't have a clue who they were, but they were hurting kids." When the networks went live around noon, hundreds of uniformed responders were present. 35 law enforcement agencies were soon represented. They had gathered an assortment of vehicles, including a Loomis Fargo armored truck whose driver had been working in the area. One student counted 35 police cars speeding past him on his 1-mile ride home from school. Ambulances and police cars barging over medians and motorcycle cops weaving through opposite traffic, almost killing themselves, he said. Half a dozen cops arrived every minute. Nobody seemed to be in charge. Some cops wanted to assault the building, but that was not the plan. Whose plan was this? Where had it come from? They reinforced the perimeter. Eric had exchanged fire with two deputies at 11:24 and 11:26 a.m., 5 and 7 minutes into the attack. Law enforcement would not fire on the killers again or advance on the building until shortly after noon. And there is number 4, which you have to do a little bit of math and approximating to do. Can't get an exact figure there. Chapter 13, One Bleeding to Death. Ribbons of yellow police tape marked the perimeter. No one was getting out of there. The issue became getting in. Onlookers, journalists, and parents were appearing as fast as policemen. They presented little threat to the deputies, but significant danger to themselves. Misty Bernal was one of the early arrivals. She did not know that her daughter was in the library or what that might portend. She only knew Cassie was missing, along with her freshman son, Chris. Misty's yard backed right up to the soccer field where Eric had fired on students, but she had arrived by a much more circuitous route. Misty was a working mom, so she was not present to hear Eric fire toward her house. But her husband, Brad, was. He had come home sick, heard a couple of pops, but thought nothing of them. Firecrackers, maybe, some pranksters. He lived beside a high school. He was used to commotion. He didn't even put his shoes on to have a look. Half an hour later, Misty sat down to lunch with a coworker and got a disturbing call. It was probably nothing, but she called Brad to check. He put on his shoes. Brad went out back and peered over the fence. Bedlam. The schoolyard was swarming with cops. Misty Bernal was a tall, attractive woman in her mid-40s with a loud voice and a commanding presence. She had full features and the same curly blonde hair as Cassie, worn in a similar style, though shorter, just past her shoulders. She could be mistaken for a much older sister. Brad was taller with dark hair and handsome, a big guy with a soft voice and a humble demeanor. They shared an intense faith in the Lord, and they began begging him to save their kids. They could cover more ground apart. Misty headed for the high school. Brad hung by the phone. At the perimeter, officers struggled to hold back the parental onslaught. TV anchors broadcast their entreaties. "As difficult as it may be, please stay away." But fresh waves of moms and dads kept swarming over the hill. Misty gave up. 2 rendezvous points had been set up. Misty chose the public library on the other side of Clement Park. She found very few students. Where were they? When they poured out of the high school, students had seen 2 main options: a subdivision across Pierce Street or the wide open fields of Clement Park. Hardly anyone chose the park. They crouched behind houses, worked themselves under shrubbery, rolled under cars. Any semblance of protection. Some pounded frantically on front doors, but most of the houses were locked. Stay-at-home moms started waving strangers in off the street. Kids were piling into houses, one student said. There must have been 150 or 200 kids piled into this house. The second rendezvous point, Leawood Elementary, sat in the heart of that neighborhood, so most of the survivors gravitated there. Parents were sent to the auditorium where kids were paraded across the stage. Moms shrieked, hugs abounded, unclaimed kids sobbed quietly backstage. Because the kids were hard to keep in one place, sign-in sheets were posted on the walls so parents could see evidence in their own child's hand. There was no parade of survivors at the public library. Misty was conflicted. Leaving for Leawood was risky. The roads had been closed, so everything was by foot now. She could easily miss her kids in transit. A local minister got up in a chair and shouted, "Please stay here." The fax would arrive any minute, he assured them. They would be better off waiting. The fax was a copy of the sign-in sheets from Leawood. Misty waited impatiently for its arrival. The mood stayed tense but restrained. Commotion erupted in little bursts. "Paul's okay," a woman screamed. She held up her cell phone. "He's at Leawood." Her husband rushed over. They hugged. They wept. Tears were rare. It was too scary to cry in fear. Only reunion allowed release. A clump of students would appear now and then over the hill. If they weren't claimed immediately, a pack of moms would descend to interrogate them. Always the same question: how did you get out? They needed reassurance. There was a way out. "I didn't know what to do," a young girl said. "We heard guns, and I was standing there, and the teacher was crying and pointing to the auditorium, and everybody was running and screaming, and we heard an explosion. I guess that was a bomb or something. I didn't see this, but we were trying to find out, and I guess they shot again, and everyone started running, and I was like, what is going on?" They started shooting again, and there was complete panic. People were shoving, they were going to the elevators, and people would like push people off, and we were all just running. Most of the stories sputtered out like that, disjointed flurries of recreated mayhem. The words ran together until the witness ran out of breath. A winsome freshman was different. She was still in her Columbine gym uniform and recounted her escape dispassionately. She had faced the gunman in the hall. She was pretty sure one had run right past her, shooting. But there was so much smoke and confusion, she wasn't sure what was happening or where or anything. Bullets ricocheted down the corridor. Glass shattered, metal clattered, chunks of plaster crashed down on the floor. Moms gasped. Someone asked if she'd feared for her life. "Not really," she said, "because the principal was with us." She said it matter-of-factly, with earnest conviction. It was just the tone a younger girl might have used to explain that she felt safe with her daddy. The stories were harrowing, but they reassured the moms, because every escape was different, but they ended the same. The kids escaped. The accumulation was soothing. And there's the answer to number 5 on chapter 13. Misty questioned every kid. "Cassie," she shouted. "Chris." She worked her way across the crowd and back again. Nothing. Command had fallen to the newly elected Jeffco sheriff, John Stone. He had not yet faced a murder case in office. The Metro cops were horrified to discover that the county was in charge. Many were open with their disgust. City and even suburban officers thought of sheriff's deputies as security guards. These were the guys who shuttled defendants to court from the jail. They had stood guard while the real cops testified about the crimes they had responded to and investigated. The grousing increased when they learned who was heading the command. John Stone looked the part of an Old West sheriff, a big, burly guy with a large potbelly and a thick gray mustache, weathered skin, and craggy eyes. He wore the uniform, the badge, and the pistol, but he was a politician. He had been a county supervisor for 12 years. He'd run for sheriff last November and had taken the oath in January. He'd appointed John Dunaway as his undersheriff, and that was another bureaucrat. The sheriff and his team defended the perimeter. Gun blasts came and went. The SWAT team seethed. When was somebody going to allow them to advance? So that's the answer to number 6, which is kind of a two-part question. Dunaway named Lieutenant David Walker incident commander. Operations would now be directed by a man who did police work for a living, with oversight from Dunaway and Sheriff Stone. The three set up a command post in a trailer station in Clement Park, half a mile north of the school. Just after noon, a SWAT team made its first approach on the school. The officers commandeered a fire truck for cover. One man drove the truck slowly toward the building while a dozen more moved alongside. Near the entrance, they split in half, 6 and 6. Lieutenant Terry Manwaring's team held back to lay down suppressive fire and later work its way to another entrance. At approximately 12:06, the other 6 charged inside. Additional SWAT team members arrived moments later and followed them. The team thought they were in striking distance of the cafeteria. They were on the opposite end of the building. Lieutenant Manwaring had been inside Columbine many times, but he was unaware it had been remodeled and the cafeteria moved. He was perplexed. The fire alarm had not been silenced. The men used hand signals. Every cupboard or broom closet had to be treated as a hot zone. Many doors were locked, so they blasted them open with rifle fire. Kids trapped in classrooms heard gunfire steadily approaching. Death appeared imminent. Parents, reporters, and even cops outside heard the shots and came to similar conclusions. One room at a time, the team worked methodically toward the killers. It would take 3 hours to reach their bodies. On the west side, where the killers were active, a fire department team staged a riskier operation. Half a dozen bodies remained on or near the lawn outside the cafeteria. Several showed signs of life. Anne-Marie, Lance, and Sean had been bleeding for 40 minutes. Deputies along the perimeter moved in closer to provide cover, while 3 paramedics and an EMT rushed in. Eric appeared in the second-floor library window and fired on them. 2 deputies shot back. Others laid down suppressive fire. The paramedics got 3 students out. Danny was pronounced dead and left behind. Eric disappeared. Lieutenant Manwaring's half of the SWAT team had inched around outside the building using the fire truck for cover. They arrived at the opposite side half an hour later. They rescued Richard Castaldo from the lawn around 12:35, an hour and a quarter after he was shot. They made another approach to retrieve Rachel Scott. They brought her back as far as the fire truck. Then they determined she was dead and aborted. They laid her there on the ground. Finally, they went for Danny Rorbo, unaware of the prior finding, and they left him on the sidewalk. At 1:15, a second SWAT team charged the building from the senior lot, smashed a window in the teacher's lounge, and vaulted in. The officers quickly entered the adjacent cafeteria, but found it nearly deserted. Food was left half-eaten on the tables. Books, backpacks, and assorted garbage floated about the room, which had been flooded by the sprinkler system. Water was 3 to 4 inches high and rising. A fire had blackened ceiling tiles and melted down some chairs. They did not notice the duffel bags held down by the weight of the bombs. One bag had burned away. The propane tank sat exposed, mostly above water, but it blended into the debris. Signs of panic were everywhere, but no injuries, no bodies, no blood. That is the answer to number 7 on chapter 13. There were lots of healthy people. The team was shocked to discover dozens of terrified students and staff. They were crouched in storage closets up above the ceiling tiles or plainly visible under cafeteria tables. One teacher had climbed into the ceiling and tried to crawl clear through the ductwork out to safety to warn police, but had fallen through and required medical care. 2 men were shivering in the freezer so cold they could barely lift their arms. The SWAT team searched them and shuttled them out the window they came in. At first that was easy, but the farther they moved, the more officers they had to leave behind to secure the route. They brought in more manpower to assist. Overhead, circling steadily, chopper blades beat out a steady thuk, 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 thuk. Robin Anderson watched it all from the parking lot. She had headed to Dairy Queen with her friends, zipped through the drive-thru, and circled back to school. There were a whole lot of cops when they got back. Officers were assembling the perimeter, but the entrance to the senior lot was still open. Robin pulled into her space. A cop strode up with his gun drawn. "Stay where you are," he warned. It was already too late to back out. Robin and her friends would wait in her car for 2.5 hours. Robin ducked when she saw Eric appear in the library window. She couldn't tell it was him. She was too far back. All she could make out was a guy in a white t-shirt firing a rifle in her general direction. Who would do something like this? Robin asked her girlfriends. Who would be this retarded? Robin looked over to her friends' faces. Eric, Dylan, and Zach had assigned spots, 3 in a row. Zach's car was there. Eric's and Dylan's were missing. Nate Dykeman was terrified of who might be responsible. He had called most of his close friends, but had held off on Eric and Dylan. He had been hoping to hear from them. Hoping, but not really expecting. Dylan would break his heart. They had been tight for years. Nate spent a lot of time at his house, and Tom and Sue Klebold had looked after him. Nate had a lot of trouble at home, and the Klebolds had been like a second mom and dad. Dylan did not call. Around noon, Nate dialed his house. Tom Klebold would be home. He worked from there. Hopefully, Dylan was with him. Tom picked up. No, Dylan was not there. He's in school, Tom said. Actually, no, he isn't, Nate said. Dylan had not been in class, and Nate didn't want to worry Tom, but there had been a shooting. There had been descriptions. The gunmen were in trench coats. Nate knew several kids with trench coats. He was trying to account for all of them. He hated breaking the news, but he had to say it. He thought Dylan was involved. Tom went up to Dylan's room, checked his closet for the coat. Oh my God, he said. It's not here. Tom was shocked, Nate said later. I thought he was going to drop the phone. He just could not believe that this could possibly be happening, and his son was involved. Please keep me informed, Tom told him. Whatever you hear. Tom got off the phone. He turned on the TV. It was everywhere. He called Sue. She came home. Tom called their older son. He and Sue had kicked Byron out for using drugs. They would not tolerate that behavior, but this was too important. Tom apparently withheld his fears about Dylan. Byron told coworkers he was terrified his brother was trapped. He was also worried about younger friends still in school. I've got to see if everybody's okay, he said. Lots of Byron's workmates were connected to the school. They all headed home. Tom Klebold called 911 to warn them his son might be involved. He also called a lawyer. The televised version of the disaster was running 30 minutes to an hour behind the cops' view. Anchors dutifully repeated the perimeter concept. The cops had sealed off the perimeter. But what were all those troops doing exactly? There were hundreds out there. Everybody seemed to be milling about. Anchors started wondering aloud. Luckily, no one seemed to be seriously injured. Around 12:30, the story took its first grisly turn. Local TV reporters gained access to the triage areas. It was awful. So much blood, it was hard to identify the injuries. Lots of kids had been loaded into ambulances. Area hospitals were all on alert. Half a dozen news choppers circled, but they withheld most of their footage. For a few minutes, stations had broadcast live from the air, but the sheriff's team had demanded they stop. Every room in Columbine was equipped with a television. The gunman might well be watching. Cameras would home in on the very images most useful to the killers: SWAT maneuvers and wounded kids awaiting rescue. TV stations also held back news of fatalities. Their chopper crews had seen paramedics examine Danny and leave him behind. The public remained unaware. The stations also caught glimpses of a disturbing scene playing out in a second-story classroom in another wing of the building, far from the library and Science Room 3. It was hard to make out exactly what was going on in there, but there was a lot of activity and one disturbing clue. Someone had dragged a large whiteboard marker to the window with a message in huge block letters. The first character looked a lot like a capital I, but turned out to be a numeral. 1 bleeding to death. And that is the answer to number 8 on chapter 13. I'll stop here and come back with chapters 14 and 15 on a separate video.